Hi, thank you so much for watching our presentation on the Greek financial crisis of 2015. The presenters for today's presentation are myself, Bonnie Richard, Ethan Simpson, and Ryan Heck. To give you an overview of our presentation, we're going to start by covering a brief history of Greece and going over some of the economic history in Greece. We're going to cover the beginning of the crisis, the warning signs and red flags of the impending financial crisis, the turning point when it was officially recognized that Greece was experiencing a financial crisis, the steps to recovery, and then we will finish up with the social impacts of the financial crisis. Alright, so just to go over a brief history of Greece, Greece did undergo significant changes in its government and political structure. It's in the early 19th century, Greece was under Ottoman rule, but it gained independence in around 1830. The newly independent nation did adopt a constitutional monarchy. They had a king as head of state and parliament that was elected by the people. However, there was a lot of political instability and frequent changes in government that characterized that period, and continuing into the 20th century, Greece actually experienced a military dictatorship from 1967 to 1974. That did lead to some pretty significant economic stagnation and a lot of political unrest. The dictatorship was overthrown and Greece returned to a democratic system of government in 1974. And this is really where our story of the financial crisis picks up. To go over a little bit of background about the economic history in Greece. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Greece's economy did experience both growth and challenges. In the early 19th century, the country was predominantly based on agriculture, and they had a limited amount of industrialization. However, in the late 19th century and then early 20th century, they did start to experience economic growth in industrialization, and particularly in the areas of shipping, tourism, and manufacturing. Following World War II, Greece received a significant amount of financial assistance from the United States through the Marshall Plan, and that did contribute to this economic growth and recovery and reconstruction. However, in the late 20th century, things started to go a little bit south. They experienced a significant amount of high inflation and they had a large public debt. They did, however, join the European Economic Community, which is now known as the EU, and that happened in 1981. And that did significantly influence its political and economic development. They officially adopted the euro on January 1st of 2001. And the introduction of the euro did help to promote economic integration, and it was aimed at facilitating trade and financial transactions among those eurozone countries. So the beginning of the crisis really started as because of the political turmoil and instability within the the Greek government. The nation found itself grappling with significant challenges in financial management. Even after the establishment of the democracy in 1974, they continued to struggle with elevated levels of fiscal mismanagement and a lack of transparency concerning their debt deficit. The impact of the 2008 global financial crisis did exacerbate the situation. It caused a pretty significant contraction in the Greek economy, and that downturn resulted in a pretty notable decline in tax revenues. This was coupled with the heightened public spending, particularly on social programs such as welfare, and those factors contributed to the continued growth of the debt deficit in Greece. The country found itself unable to meet its financial obligations, and it did reach a point of no return that we will begin to look into a little bit more throughout this presentation. There is one important thing to note on this slide here. In 2004, the Greek government did openly admit that its budget figures had been understated to meet the entry requirements for the Eurozone's single currency. So what that means is that they did fudge the numbers in order to be able to adopt the euro, and that's never a good sign. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Ryan, who will continue with the presentation, talking about some of those warning signs and red flags that we can see in the economic situation in Greece at the time.
Thanks, Bonnie. My name is Ryan Heck. In the next few slides, we're going to be looking at some graphical representations of the economy in Greece during the years prior to the crisis. This graph shows the increase in government debt as a percentage of GDP for Greece between 2002 and 2016. The debt percentage was already fairly high in 2008, but began to jump drastically for the next 5 years, as you can see on the graph. Moving on to my next slide, I'm going to take a look at the surge in credit to the private sector. And if you notice, at the same time, right around where the GDP increases from between 2002 to 2016, much of the same is shown here between the credit in the private sector. And it's a pretty significant increase around 2009, a few years prior to the 2015 collapse. As we look at my next slide, we can see from the graph that there's a dramatic increase in the unemployment rate starting in 2011 and continuing until right around 2015. And it's been on a significant decline in the recent years, but the initial spike starting in 2009 was enough that a lot of the industry and the economy could have been affected at the time. Unlike the previous slides, this slide actually shows a decrease in GDP starting in 2009, and it shows a trend downward until right around 2015, where it starts to slightly increase. But the significant drop between 2009 and 2015 has had an immediate impact within the economy in Greece. So in summary, there are some pretty strong indicators for the financial crisis that showed up in Greece. And all of these red flags and warning signs were signs of an impending crisis. As we move on to the next slide, we'll take a look at everything that hit the wall and came to a turning point. And that's where I'll actually be leaving it off to Ethan to continue our presentation.
The turning point. The turning point can be ironically traced to the Olympics game back in 2004. Greece hosted an Olympic game costing around 19 billion euros. So Greece had to borrow money to heavily support this expense, making them an obligation to pay off any debt. The European Commission placed Greece under fiscal monitoring in 2005 due to its unstable finances. In October 2009, George Papandreou, the Prime Minister, revealed that Greece's budget deficit was going to exceed 12% of the GDP, later revised to the 15.4%. This is resulting in a credit downgrade and soaring borrowing costs in 2010. After the Prime Minister George Papandreou announced in 2009 that Greece's budget deficit would exceed 12% of the GDP, which was later revised to the 15.4%, it would trigger a loss in the confidence among investors in the international market. The revelation of much higher than expected deficit raised concern about the credibility of Greece's financial reporting and the sustainability of the public's finances. Credit rating agencies downgraded Greece's sovereign debt to junk status, indicating a higher risk of defaulting. As a result, other countries and investors became wary of lending and investing in Greece, fearing that this country might struggle to meet its debt obligations. The increased risk associated with Greek investments led to a spike in borrowing costs for the Greek government, making it more expensive for Greece to raise funds in the international financial market. The loss of investors' confidence and the subsequent reluctance to invest or lend to Greece contributed to a deepening of Greece's financial crisis. Greece hit a point of no return. With the unemployment rate increasing, GDP decreasing, and the government debt still increasing, they had to do something. The answer was the bailouts. The first bailout was in 2010, where the International Monetary Fund and the European Union provided 110 billion euros in loans over the 3 years to prevent the defaulting. Germany's contributed to the large amount of sum in the return, and the Prime Minister Papandreou of Greece committed to austerity measures. In 2012, a second bailout of 130 billion euros was approved, involved a debt write-down for private bond holders and a commitment to reduce Greece's debt to GDP ratio. A third bailout of 86 billion euros was agreed upon in 2015. This required Greece to implement economic reforms, privatize state assets, and cut public spending. And lastly, unemployment reached an all-time low as it has in the last past 10 years. The European Central Bank announced that it planned to buy unlimited government bonds in September 2012 as part of its effort to address the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone. The announcement was made by ECB president who pledged to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro dollar. This move was aimed at claiming financial markets, stabilizing the euro, and preventing a further escalation of the debt crisis in the eurozone. They did not want to spend this to any other countries as well. And what this did was to reestablish trust in the euro as a currency. So did this process work? Yes, the GDP was stabilized and the deficit decreased and the unemployment decreased as well. So according to the economic indicators, the bailouts worked. However, as we see on the next slide, the bailouts came with strict austerity measures that greatly impacted the people of Greece. By 2017, unemployment began a slow decline and growth returned to a positive territory.
As part of the recovery process for this financial crisis in Greece, there were some austerity measures that were implemented by the EU as part of their bailout packages. Those austerity measures include spending cuts, tax increases, pension reforms, privatization of assets, new fiscal targets, and then labor market structural and financial reforms. Now, those austerity measures had a direct impact on the people of Greece, and the people in Greece were not necessarily happy with these austerity measures, and there was a lot of talk about how they felt like they should not have been held responsible for the lack of financial management on the government, and because it was really passed on to the people in Greece with the spending cuts, so that was spending on welfare and other social programs, and then the tax increases. So these were felt primarily by the people of Greece, and because of that, did result in a lot of public discontent and social unrest in Greece. Continuing with the social impact, there were a lot of riots that occurred. These were anti-austerity riots. There was one instance where the people of Greece were very adamant that the Greek government not accept any more austerity measures as part of the bailout plan. And when they found out that the government had agreed to more austerity measures, they were very upset, and so it led to a full-on riot, and it led to many full riots and demonstrations. One of the most notable ones was in February of 2012. There were tens of thousands of people that gathered to express their opposition of the government's austerity measures, and it did start out peacefully, like they always do, but then it escalated into violence. The police responded to the violence with tear gas and stun grenades and other crowd control measures. The clashes between the demonstrators and law enforcement, it continued for several hours, and the picture here in the slide is showing one of the buildings that was burned during the protest. And what some of these protesters were doing is they were taking bottles or glasses full of alcohol, and then they would light it on fire and throw it into a building, and so that's why they were lighting these buildings on fire. To conclude, the financial crisis ended in bailouts by the EU and the ICB, and it did help restore the country's economy. However, there were lasting impacts to the people of Greece by the imposition of those severe austerity measures, and those austerity measures or the impacts from those austerity measures can still be felt in the people of Greece today. Just to close it up here, we do appreciate you taking the time to watch our presentation. If you have any questions about our presentation, feel free to email me or any of the other team members. We would be happy to answer any of the questions. Our email is listed here on this slide. And again, thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.